9. Survival of the fittest. Sarah stared at Ross in anger and pity. The guy was a total nutcase, apparently oblivious to the incredible pain and suffering he had caused in the pursuit of this insane dream of his. He had detailed, without any shame or remorse, crime after crime against human and non-human species. And he seemed to think that she should be pleased to die so he could use her for spare parts? "You're mad, you know that?" she asked him. She tried to sound cheerful and brave, but she was terrified of him. He didn't seem at all bothered by her comment. "Sadly," he informed her, "one of the guards was slain last night, and I need to produce a replacement. This is where you'll provide me with the help I need, Sarah. Your fluids will enable me to mutate a new guard and allow my work to continue. You should be very proud of your contribution to science." "Thanks a lot, but I could skip the honour," she answered. "Couldn't I just leave you my body in my will?" "Come on now," he admonished her. "Don't be so reactionary. You have to die anyway, since you persisted in investigating matters that were none of your concern. Raintree and Brogan would happily murder you for an evening's entertainment if I allowed it, but they would be unlikely to return your corpse to me in a state I could use. This way I promise you a painless death and some achievement once you have expired. Wouldn't you prefer that?" "Can I sleep on it and let you know in the morning?" she asked. Ross laughed, genuinely amused. It was scary how he could divorce his conscience and his mind like that. "Oh, I'm rather sorry to lose you, Sarah. You do provide me with such amusement." "Court jester extraordinaire, that's me," Sarah said. "Look, why don't you just buy me a nice fool's costume, and I'll be happy to hang around and entertain you." "I'm sorry," he replied, and he did sound genuinely sad. "But that's not a viable option." He picked up a scalpel from the table beside him. "Goodbye, Sarah. It's been a pleasure chatting with you, but I'm afraid that it has to end now. I'm on a rather tight schedule, you know, and business is business." Sarah's eyes focused in horror on the sharp tip of the instrument as he moved towards her. Her heart was pounding, and she wanted to scream. Terror welled up within her as he moved slowly and relentlessly across the room to murder her. As the small party reached the locked gates to the factory, Ross turned to Abercrombie. "Time for you to earn your pay," he said. Abercrombie sighed and moved to the padlock. "I've been meaning to speak to you about that," he said. "I think I deserve danger money for these here jobs. I'm in grave danger of being murdered once we get inside here." "You'll need it even more if you don't hurry," Ross informed him. "I'm likely to murder you here and now." "Is that what you call an incentive?" grumbled Abercrombie. As he complained, he worked on the lock using a piece of bent wire and a nail file. After a second, there was a soft snick, and the padlock sprang open. "You may applaud if you wish." "We don't," Ross answered, helping to remove the chain that held the two gates together. One by one, they filed through the gate, leaving it slightly ajar as they passed on towards the main building. "I believe the route we have to take is through the main working area," the doctor informed Ross. The colonel nodded, leading the way to the side entrance. There was a large oaken door here, sturdy and padlocked. During the day, it would be opened to allow the delivery of supplies to the work floor. In the corner of the larger door was a smaller one, also equipped with a strong-looking lock. "Can you open that up quickly?" Ross asked Abercrombie. His assistant examined the lock carefully under a tight beam from his dark lantern, then shook his head. "No way," he replied. "It's too modern for that. I could be here all night fiddling with that." "What do we do now?" asked Doyle, frustration tinging his voice. "Use the other option," replied the little thief. "Here, hold this." He gave Doyle the lantern, and then removed a small hammer and spike from his pocket. Using the spike, he gestured at the hinges. "Typical dumb mistake," he pointed out. "Put on a big lock and think the door's impregnable. He grinned and then used the spike to tap out the rod from the hinges. Ross and the doctor then pulled the door apart. "Easy when you know how," Abercrombie said, grinning. "We'll send you a thank you later," the doctor informed him. He peered cautiously inside the factory floor. "It appears deserted. Come on." The small group hurried after him to the lathe he had spotted earlier. Now that Doyle looked closely, he could see that there were indeed scratch marks in the floor in a quarter circle, starting at the lathe's left corner. "Now ain't that corny," sighed Abercrombie. "You'd think there'd be more bleeding inventive, wouldn't you?" "It appears to work," the doctor answered. "There's probably a release catch somewhere on the base that prevents it from moving accidentally." Ross nodded and bent to examine the bottom rim of the heavy base with his own lantern. After a second, they all heard a click. "I think that's it," Ross announced, straightening up. "Shall we?" The four of them pushed on the right-hand side of the lathe. Silently, it swung about on a pivot, revealing a dark pit below. The top 5 or 6 steps of a flight of stairs leading down into the grounds were visible in the dim light cast by their lanterns. "Will you step into my parlour?" intoned the doctor. "What other choice do we have?" asked Ross. "I'll go first." Using his walking stick to probe the darkness ahead of him, he led the way down. The doctor and then Doyle followed. "I'll just wait for you here," suggested Abercrombie. "A rear guard, if you like." "You'd better guard your rear if you don't come on," growled Ross. "Else I'll deliver a swift kick up it." Abercrombie sighed and started down the steps after them. Ross and Doyle had their dark lanterns opened part way, allowing only trickles of light out. As a result, their descent of the stairs was carried on in a small, dull circle of illumination. 10 steps down, and it was as if they were in another world entirely. There was the soft sound of dripping water from ahead of them. In silence, they slowly descended the stairs. After about 100 steps, the stairs ended in a short passage that sloped gently forward. Ross risked opening the aperture of his lantern slightly so that they could see down the passageway. It culminated in a large iron doorway about 20 feet ahead of them. Turning down the light, he led the way to the bulkhead door. In the centre of this was a wheel. "In case of trouble," the doctor murmured. "We must be below sea level now. This can be locked in case of leaks." "Yeah," muttered Abercrombie. "Plumbers must be hard to come by down here." Ross gestured for the others to stand back, and then gripped the wheel. Slowly he turned it anti-clockwise. Soundlessly it moved, and then the door swung open. Beyond it lay another dark area. Silent again, they filed forward while Ross started to close the door behind them. Doyle used his lantern to examine the room that they were in. It was hewn from the rough bedrock and only about 6 feet across. It was completely empty, but an identical door to the one they had just passed through stood slightly ajar opposite them. The doctor nodded to indicate their way forward. Doyle started to push the door open, when it was suddenly yanked from his grasp and swung wide. 2 almost intolerably bright lights snapped on, dazzling the 4 adventurers. Doyle cried out in pain and surprise. "Good evening, gentlemen," Breckinridge said amiably from beyond the glare. "I fear you're a trifle late for the daily guided tour, but please do come inside." Shielding his eyes from the brightness, Doyle staggered forward as the doctor shoved him from behind. He stumbled across the threshold and past the 2 glowing lights. Beyond them, he saw the factory owner and 2 nasty-looking customers carrying sidearms that were pointed in the direction of the 4 of them. Breckinridge pulled a pocket watch from his waistcoat and glanced at it. "Almost midnight already. Dear me, if you'd simply made an appointment earlier with my secretary, all of this tedious waiting could have been avoided." "I shall remember that," the doctor promised. "The next time I plan a secret mission to stop the grandiose schemes of a deluded megalomaniac." He grinned at Breckinridge. No offence meant. Oh, none taken, Dr. Smith. Breckinridge's smile seemed quite genuine and unforced. Doctor who? Asked Abercrombie of his master. Ross stomped on his foot, making the tubby thief wince. If you've all quite finished, asked Breckinridge, I think you've kept me up quite late enough as it is. Shall we get this over with so that I can get a little rest? I have a busy day ahead of me tomorrow, you know. You really can't imagine how hard it is to run a factory. You scoundrel! Exclaimed Doyle. Do you expect us to sympathise with you? No, Doctor, Breckinridge answered. I expect you to die. Then I expect the little fishies outside will have a feast. Beyond that, I couldn't care less what you do. He gestured with one hand, and the two men with him raised their guns. Excuse me, said the doctor, politely raising his hand. Could I ask for a teensy little favour first? Breckinridge sighed. Really, Doctor, you do try my patience, you know. I do so hate late nights. Early to bed, early to rise, and all that. I always preferred Thurber myself, the doctor replied. Early to rise and early to bed makes a man healthy, wealthy, and dead. Well, Breckinridge told him, you're about to prove the truth of that saying. Now, what is this favour of yours? The doctor glanced at the floor. It's a failing of mine, he confessed, but I'd really hate to be killed without knowing exactly why I'm being murdered. I mean, I can see that you're a busy man, things to do, worlds to conquer, infinitives to split and all that. But could you spare just a little time to enlighten me on a few points? The businessman smiled. I suppose I do owe you that at the very least. He considered the matter for a moment. Very well, he agreed. I'll illuminate you concerning my plans. Then Raintree and Brogan will kill you. Happier now? Absolutely ecstatic, the doctor assured him. So what's it all about, Alfie? I'm sorry? This whole scheme, the doctor said, gesturing about him. Hiding in slimy little tunnels, killing poor innocent fishermen, snatching bodies, breeding dogs that Crufts wouldn't even think of giving a blue ribbon to. That sort of thing. Breckinridge nodded. You're wondering what the point of all this activity is, I take it? Exactly, the doctor beamed. How succinct. So, tell me, what's the point of all this activity? Progress, Doctor, progress! Breckinridge smiled happily and waved his hands around. This is the wave of the future, Doctor. Really? Asked Ross, mildly amused. Humanity is going to start living in leaky subterranean tunnels? Doesn't sound like much of a future to me. Breckinridge glared at him. Mock me if you choose, he said coldly, but remember who holds the power here. He turned to the doctor. Really, how could you ally yourself with such a crass individual? The doctor shrugged. Necessity makes for strange bedfellows, he suggested. Now, what was that you said about progress? Breckinridge nodded. Come with me, Doctor, and I will show you more wonders than any man has ever imagined. He glared at Raintree. Watch them all. If any of them makes a false move, shoot him. Otherwise, don't harm them until I'm finished. With a charming smile, he said, Gentlemen, if you'd care to follow me. I think I speak for us all, the doctor murmured, when I say that we're a captive audience. Lead on, Macduff. Holding the scalpel in front of him, Ross moved slowly across the laboratory towards Sarah. I promise you, he said, this will be as swift and painless as I can manage. I have no desire to hurt you. Well, I've plenty of desire to hurt you, snapped Sarah. Her pain and fear had built within her to almost fever pitch, but she wasn't about to let him get away with his insane plans. She gripped the pipe over her head with her hands and waited for him to move closer. As he stepped within 4 feet of her, she exploded into action. She whipped up her right foot with as much force as she could muster. Her toe slammed into his wrist with bone-shattering impact. The scalpel flew from his nerveless fingers, clattering to the ground in the distance. Ross screamed and used his good hand to grip his smashed right wrist. Suspending herself from her hands, Sarah whipped up her legs, hooking her right foot behind his neck and pulling him toward her. Then she slammed down her left foot on his back. She felt the heel of her shoe crunch down hard on his ribs and heard the distinct sound of a bone breaking. Ross screamed wordlessly as he fell to the cold floor. Panting, Sarah twisted about to try and use her feet on him again. But though Ross was wounded and in pain, he wasn't stupid enough to stay still. Crab-like, he scuttled out of her reach, then tried to straighten up. He winced, and his skin turned a sickly shade of white as he succeeded in regaining his feet. "My hand!" he screamed. "You've broken my hand!" Sarah glared at him through her fringe. "What a wimp!" she mocked him. "You don't care how much pain and misery you've inflicted on others, do you? But break one little bone in your hand and you start blubbering like a baby." "You'll pay for that," he hissed, glaring in anger and agony at her. He was still nursing his broken wrist, and was slightly hunched over as a result of the blow from her heel. "Oh, you'll pay for that." "It'll be worth it," she told him. She wanted him mad enough to attack her again. Despite appearances, she was actually at an advantage here. Ross had been expecting some meek Victorian maid who would faint at the thought of what he'd do to her. He probably still didn't realise how much she was capable of, but he'd find out if he gave her half a chance. "Come on," she encouraged him. "I'm not going anywhere, am I? Almost as easy as kidnapping helpless children, isn't it?" He cast his eyes around the laboratory, clutching his hand. "I've got to get this seen to," he muttered, refusing to be baited. "Stick it in your healing jelly," she suggested. "That should do the trick." She grinned. "As long as there's nothing else in there, of course. You didn't sort of fly, did you? Maybe you'll grow compound eyes if there's a fly in your ointment." That taunt hit home. Ross stared uncertainly at the container of the salve. He was obviously a basically weak and insecure man, prey to nightmares and massive feelings of inferiority. Sarah was certain that she could get him worked up enough to become reckless if she had the time alone with him. She didn't. The door to the laboratory opened, and the doctor walked in. "Doctor!" she exclaimed happily. "Am I glad to see you? It's a bit tiring, all this hanging around." The doctor shook his head and pointed to Breckinridge, who had followed him in. One by one, Doyle, Colonel Ross, Abercrombie, Brogan, and Raintree filed into the room. "This isn't a rescue, I'm afraid, Miss Smith," Breckinridge said pleasantly. "It's not even a party," agreed the doctor. "I forgot to bring the cake." He peered at Ross. "Ah, you must be the mad scientist, I assume." He held out a hand. Ross whimpered. "Sorry," Sarah apologised. "He's not going to be shaking hands for a while. I'm afraid I broke it. Careless of me, I know." "Very," agreed the doctor. Colonel Ross stepped forward and glared at his younger brother in disgust. "Percival," he growled, "you've certainly disgraced the family name." "Percival!" echoed the doctor in mock horror. "This whole insane scheme was dreamed up by a man named Percival. Oh, that's too dreadful for words." His eyes darted about the laboratory, intrigued, and came to rest on the vat of gelatin. "Ah, so that is what is behind all this." He wandered across to it. Brogan raised his revolver, lining up on the doctor's back, but Breckinridge shook his head. "There's no need for that, yet," he said. "So, Doctor, what do you think that is?" His face almost in the goo, the doctor replied, "It's obvious. Rutan healing salve. The store brand, too, by the stench of it." He dipped his finger in and examined the glob. Then he sucked it off his finger. "Cherry, my favourite flavour." Breckinridge stared at him in shock. "Don't you know what that can do to you?" he gasped, appalled at what he had just witnessed. "I know what it can do to you," as the doctor countered. "It won't affect me." "It affects any human being," croaked Ross, ashen at the thought of what the doctor had done. "Precisely," agreed the doctor. He wandered over to the closest aquarium tank and stared down at the baby seal inside. "Hello, little fellow. Lost your mummy?" "Doctor," Doyle asked, "what the blazes is going on here? Do you really know what that stuff is?" Yes, the doctor replied, spinning about on the balls of his feet. It's Rutan healing salve. The Rutans are a species of amorphous nature that live, he gestured vaguely in the air, in a galaxy far, far away. They have the ability to alter their appearance because their cellular structure is unstable. As a result, when one of them is injured, they need a medication that is pretty unstable too. Like this goo. The problem is that the salve works on the basis of reforming the amorphous cells. When it comes in contact with some non-Rutan tissue, it causes genetic fusion. Which we witnessed in the Hound Boy and the Mermaids, finished Sarah. Precisely. Colonel Ross raised an eyebrow. And these Rutans of which you speak, they are of otherworldly origin? Very, the doctor grinned at the agent. Do you find that rather incredible? No, Ross replied. I've seen too many strange things during the course of my life to balk at the thought of a non-earthly life form. A thought seemed to dawn on him. Ah, Doctor, am I to take it that you are another? The doctor's smile grew even wider. I knew it would dawn on someone sooner or later. Doyle shook his head. This is all getting far too preposterous for me, he opined. Me too, agreed Abercrombie. Non-humans? I hate non-humans. I've had enough bleeding non-humans to last me several lifetimes. Sarah realised that the doctor had obviously learned something about Colonel Ross's past that was still hidden from her. But it was obvious that Ross was on their side, at least for now, which definitely made matters interesting. Counting Ross's brother, there were 4 of the villains here, not counting her, since she was manacled and hardly free to move. There were 4 on the other side, even forces if Brogan and Raintree had not been armed. She decided that the best thing she could do was to keep attention focused on her and trust the doctor to improvise something as usual. Junior Ross here, she said, nodding at the scientist, mentioned finding the stuff on a flying saucer that had crashed in Limehouse. Part of their almost eternal war with the Sontarans, Sarah, the doctor answered. They've been fighting in this sector for a while. The Rutan must have been a casualty and come down in flames. He glared at the tub. Which is where that stuff belongs. No, Doctor, Breckinridge broke in. That stuff belongs with me. Ross and I have a great deal more use for it yet. I don't get it, Sarah said, puzzled. I can see what Frankenstein hopeful here gets out of all this. He's just wild about breeding his own life forms, like that poor kid in the bottle over there. But what's in it for you? Just the pleasure of hurting little kids, robbing graves and killing people. Breckinridge was stung by this. Miss Smith, he protested, you do me a grave injustice. I am not some mindlessly sadistic monster. Surely that is obvious. What is obvious, Colonel Ross said coldly, is that you are a depraved human being who has no thought for the consequences of his actions. Oh, well done, thought Sarah. Ross's accusation had really wounded Breckinridge's pride. The factory owner went almost purple with rage, and then managed to gather his wits together. Very well, then, he said, frost dripping from his voice. No thought for the consequences of my action, indeed. Well, I'll show you just how wrong you are. Breckinridge, the scientist said, the pain still twisting his voice. He's taunting you now. He does this all the time. Kill him now. Better yet, let me kill him. Brotherly love, murmured the doctor dreamily. How much of a fool do you think I am? Growled Breckinridge. I know what he's trying to do, and if you want to murder him, you can be my guest. But not until after he's seen what I am creating here. He glared at the colonel. I am not having him die thinking I'm a savage. Oi, put in Sarah. What about me? Breckinridge studied her for a moment. Then he nodded at Ross. Get her down from there. I want her to see this as well. Ross shook his head. I don't trust her, he protested. She's already broken my hand, and... I'll break the other one for you if you don't do as you're told, screamed Breckinridge. He raised his hand on the verge of slapping Ross. It was clear to Sarah that Breckinridge didn't like his orders questioned. even when they were quite idiotic. Ross, terrified of further pain, ducked and scuttled across to where Sarah was hanging from the pipes. It took him a minute to fish the key to the handcuffs from his pocket, and even longer to manage to unlock them one-handed. Sarah sighed happily as she could finally lower her arms. They'd felt like the joints were about to break at any moment. Rubbing her wrists, she joined the other captives. Breckinridge smiled at her. "And, lest you think that my decision to allow you to join us shows evidence of any favour in your direction, or weakness on my part—" His hand whipped around in a savage blow to her cheek that threw her backwards across the floor. "Think again, please." Sarah cried out in pain and stumbled backwards into the tanks, smacking down hard on the floor. Her backside stung, and there was the taste of blood in her mouth. "There was no need for that," the doctor growled at Breckinridge. "On the contrary," the businessman purred. "Or would you prefer me to have Brogan shoot someone so that you understand the situation here?" "Brogan would happily do that. He likes to kill people." Breckinridge sighed theatrically. "He does have such simple tastes, but he's a dedicated worker." "It's okay," Sarah said. She wiped at her mouth with the back of her right hand. Blood smeared across it, which she wiped off rather obviously onto her skirt. "I'm not badly damaged." She groaned as she started to rise, but for effect and not from pain. The scalpel she had knocked out of Ross's hand earlier now lay inside her left sleeve. Her ostentatious mannerisms with the blood had been to distract attention while she palmed the fallen weapon. Simply having it gave her more courage. Breckinridge and his minions might aim to kill them all, but she would go down fighting, if she went down at all. "Very well," Breckinridge announced. "Let's be moving out of here. Ross, Dr. Ross," he added with stress, "lead the way to the viewing room." He turned to the doctor. "I'm sure Miss Smith informed you that the ocean is something of a passion with me." "It's nice to see that you have a few innocent passions," the doctor answered, as he fell in beside his adversary. "Oh, I have lots of them," the man laughed, "though you may not believe it." "You're right," agreed the doctor, just as cheerfully. "I don't." He glanced around as Sarah joined him. Doyle, Colonel Ross, and Abercrombie, muttering gloomily under his breath, followed them, and the two thugs brought up the rear as they paraded out of the laboratory. Sarah realized that the rest of the subterranean passageways and rooms that had been added to the factory were all in roughly the same shape as the laboratory. The passageway bent at odd angles several times, showing that it had been cut to follow the pathway of an old cave system. The rooms that they passed were closed, and presumably had been cut from large openings. The walls were rough and unfinished, with electric lights at set intervals, linked by thick cables that snaked along the passageway. The sound of dripping water increased, and the floor shone in spots where puddles gathered in the uneven surface. She had the distinct impression that they had now travelled under the sea bed. At one of the doors they passed, the doctor halted, frowning. "What's in there?" he demanded. There was the sound of movement within the room. "Precautions, Doctor," answered Dr. Ross. "The SEALs aren't the only guards I've bred for this place. Thus far, though, the guardians in there haven't been needed." "More abominations," muttered Doyle. "My brother has a fertile mind when it comes to such matters," Colonel Ross said, quietly but audibly. "What he lacks in intelligence he makes up for in depravity." His brother whirled to glare furiously at him. "I've been in your shadow all my life," he snarled. "It was always, 'You're not half the man your brother is, Percival,' and 'Look how well Edmund is doing at Oxford, Percival.' Well, I've had enough. Today I shall prove to everyone that I'm the more intelligent Ross, because I'll be alive and creating a new world, and you'll be dead." "So there," added the doctor. "Talk about an inferiority complex." "I've never seen a more complex, Sarah offered. Breckinridge shook his head sadly. "Please, can we dispense with the silly jokes? I'd hate to have to dispense with either of you before you see our triumph. Through the next door, if you please, Doctor." He stood aside to allow the doctor and Sarah to precede him. Sarah dutifully followed the doctor into the indicated room, and then stood just inside, staring in wonder at what she could see. The far wall was almost entirely glass. It was about 20 feet long and half that in height. She couldn't guess its depth, but it had to be pretty thick to hold out the pressure of the water beyond. As a result, the glass wasn't crystal clear. Patches had a smoky appearance, and some parts were not quite level, but it was enough to show what lay outside. Outside lay the ocean. Rows of lights led away from the gigantic window, set into the seabed and glowing faintly. The illumination was low level, but sufficient to show them what lay out there. Sarah took several steps forward as the others crowded into the room behind her. She heard Doyle gasp in amazement at the view. "Quite staggering, isn't it?" asked Breckinridge proudly. Sarah didn't want to admit that it was, so she continued moving. There was only one piece of furniture in the room, a table of sorts. Strapped to it, unconscious, was Kipling. She spared him a quick glance to be certain he was still breathing, then moved until she was touching the huge window. The seabed looked marvellous. Rocks, pebbles and sand were illuminated gently. In the distance, probably only a few hundred yards away in the dark waters, was a large wheel set in a spool. Attached to the wheel were more lights. This was clearly the source of the mysterious lighting that they had witnessed from their boat the previous night. Closer to the window was a garden of sorts. There were seaweeds there and other plants, all in neat short rows. They were obviously being cultivated, and Sarah gasped as she saw the workers in these strange fields. There were almost 24 of them, merfolk, all children. Each of them was naked, their upper torsos human, their lower sections dolphinine. They moved slowly along the rows, weeding and checking the growing plants. Sarah stared at them and recognized one of them as the girl who had saved her life. She looked as if she were the oldest one among them, and seemed to be in some kind of charge over them. Beyond the workers, though, were 3 dark shapes that moved continually, the Seal Guards. "Dear Lord," said Doyle fervently from behind her. "They're bleedin' real," muttered Abercrombie. He glanced uncertainly at his boss. "I guess your warped brother ain't entirely mad." "On the contrary," the doctor said, in a soft, dangerous voice that Sarah knew too well. "He's criminally insane." The doctor whirled around to glower at Breckinridge and Ross. "Those are children out there that you've mutilated." "Mutilated?" Breckinridge sounded incredulous. "Doctor, they're not mutilated at all. They're magnificent. They can stay out there indefinitely, harvesting the sea, and they are viable, the nucleus of a brand new race. I assure you they are not ill-treated." "They're slaves," the doctor thundered. "That's why you need those guards, to prevent your slave army from escaping." "They're useful for the first time in their miserable little lives," protested Breckinridge. "Doctor, every one of those children out there was doomed to die if they stayed here on the land. They're all from the docks and wharves and gutters. Parasites, scavengers, and worse. Now, thanks to Ross and myself, they have useful, productive lives." "Useful to you," the doctor countered. "Production for you. None of them was given the chance to decide whether they wanted that life or not. You made that choice for them." "They were hardly in a position to make rational judgments, Doctor," Breckinridge argued. "Dirty, ill-educated, disgusting little urchins from the dregs of the street. Now look at them. They're magnificent." "Not all of them," Sarah said quietly. "One of them is a boy named Anders from the same school as Kipling. He's got parents that care for him, and he wouldn't have been a parasite." "True," agreed Breckinridge, "but he stumbled across us one night when certain supplies were being delivered. It was either change him or kill him." He nodded at the glass. "I assume you approve of the choice I made?" "I approve of nothing you do," she answered. "It's inhuman, disgusting, and perverted." Breckinridge flushed. "I should have known that you wouldn't understand," he snapped. "Can't you see that those children are better out there than they would be if this asinine government of ours had their way? All this talk of educating the street brats. What a waste! They don't have the minds or the imaginations to take advantage of an education. And who would pay for their waste of time? Businessmen like myself. That's who. Well, out there, he gestured savagely out of the window again, is my response to the unwanted children. We can transform them, put them to useful work, to extend man's dominion. To enslave them, the doctor added coldly. To make them work for you. That's the real reason, isn't it? He pointed to the garden. That's pathetic. A sham. What you really have in mind is to make the children work for you. Isn't that it? That wheel of light of yours has no real point, does it? It has its reasons, Doctor, Breckinridge responded. I'm training those children because, as you rightly observe, they will have to work to repay me for all I've done for them. I foresee a future, Doctor, where the world is linked by communication. The telegraph is outmoded, and the telephone is just beginning. I see a day when pictures as well as words can be transmitted through such cables, and he who has the network in place will be the master of this new world. So that's it, said Colonel Ross. Those children are being trained to work so they can lay your cables. Precisely, agreed Breckinridge. Do you have any idea how expensive it is to lay cables from ships? And if one breaks, there's no way to repair it. You have to start over again, laying a new seabed cable. But with my race of merfolk out there, those problems cease. They can lay the cables and even repair them if needed at any depths. They're the perfect workers, and they will help me to become the leader in a new world order. I pity you, the doctor said, in that icy, dangerous tone of his. Ross, at least, is doing his filthy work as a perversion of science. But you are doing it simply to make more money. And what's wrong with making money? Cried Breckinridge. Without men like me, this world would grind to a sorry halt in days. It is my money that gives the people here in town work. It's my money that funds research and brings on the future. It's your money that bastardizes everything that we hold holy and just, snapped Colonel Ross. This perversion is sickening and must be destroyed. No, snapped the doctor. Ross, try and control that indignation of yours. He pointed out of the window. Those are children out there. They never asked for the fate they've been given, and they're innocent of any blame. Whatever they may once have been, countered Ross, they are abominations now. If you touch one of those children, the doctor vowed, I shall personally take great pleasure in breaking every bone in your body, commencing with those in your inner ears. Breckinridge laughed. Come now, gentlemen, he said, please don't argue about this. After all, you seem to forget who is in charge here. It is I, not you, who decides what shall happen. You are both powerless. He smirked at all his captives. The future belongs to me, not to any of you, because none of you has a future. You're wrong, said Sarah flatly. You don't have a future. I know, because I'm from it. What? Breckinridge stared at her, his face a twisted mass of emotions. It was clear that he didn't quite believe that claim, but also that he wasn't certain what she was up to. His eyes narrowed. You expect me to believe that? You're just trying to believe it, Sarah told him. I'm not due to be born for over 60 years yet. I'm from that future you're talking about, and I can tell you that nowhere are you mentioned. Oh, everything you've talked about is there, and more, but there's no genius named Breckinridge anywhere in it. She gestured towards Kipling. In fact, he's going to become far more famous than you could ever be. He's going to become a great writer. That snotty-nosed little schoolboy, sneered Breckinridge. You're trying to say that he will be known and I won't? Yes, Sarah glared at him. So believe me, you may think you're winning, but you're doomed. Your insane plan can't succeed because I'm from the future where it hasn't succeeded. Anger and disbelief waged war for the businessman's features. Anger finally won. I'm still not sure that I believe you, Miss Smith, even though you are like no other woman I've ever met. But I can disprove your little theory quite simply. He glared at Ross. Take Kipling there to your laboratory now, and give him a dose of the salve." He smiled tightly at Sarah. "Let's see if he can still become a great writer when he has to spend the rest of his life underwater. His paper is liable to get a trifle damp, I fear." Sarah gasped with shock. "No," she said. "You can't do that. You can't change history." "Your history, Miss Smith, not mine." Breckinridge smiled, self-assured again. "And if I change that small detail, then everything else will change as well, won't it?" "Yes," agreed the doctor darkly. "If you can change one brick, the wall of recorded human history will tumble down." Breckinridge nodded happily. "Then do it," he ordered Ross. Sarah watched in horror as the scientist crossed to the unconscious schoolboy and started to unfasten him from the table. She'd really done it this time. She'd hoped to convince Breckinridge to give up, but all she'd managed to do was to make him grimly determined to change the course of history as she knew it. Was it possible? Could he somehow succeed? The doctor seemed to believe it could happen. Was Sarah about to be the unwitting pivot about which history would shift and change? Lucy pulled another strand of seaweed from the vegetable patch and slipped it into the collecting bag that she carried slung across her shoulders. As she did so, she glanced at the observation room in front of her. Sometimes she had seen Ross in there, watching his creations. At others, Breckinridge would be there, staring out at the empire he was hoping to create for himself. Lucy stared in astonishment as she saw that the viewing room was almost overflowing with people. And she recognized two of them. One of them was definitely the young woman she had prevented from drowning. The other one was the man who had helped the woman back to the surface. What were they doing here? She swam closer to the glass wall to get a better look. Then she saw that Brogan and Raintree were there, the two men who had captured her in the first place, and three other men that she didn't recognize. And there was another person strapped down to a table. Brogan and Raintree had guns, so the two people she knew and the other three had to be prisoners. What was going on? "Joshua!" she called to the newcomer. He'd been with them only a little while, but he seemed to be filled with fire and intelligence. She liked him and felt she could rely on him. "Look at the viewing room." Joshua swam slowly to join her. His eyes narrowed and he frowned. "What's going on?" he asked softly. "It looks like the woman I helped last night is in trouble again," Lucy explained. "I think she and her friends are trying to stop Ross and Breckinridge." "It does look like that," Joshua agreed. "In fact—" He gave a little jump of shock. "That boy on the table! I know him! That's Giga!" "Who?" "Someone from my school," Joshua explained, excited. "He must have been looking for me. These people are trying to fight those villains, I bet." "Then they're not doing very well," Lucy observed. "They're in serious trouble by the looks of things." "Then we have to try and help them, Lucy," said Joshua eagerly. "If they can manage to stop Ross and Breckinridge, then we'll be free." "Do you think so?" She wanted so desperately to believe that, but one of the guards swam swiftly over, squealing a warning at them. Lucy knew that it meant return to work. The seal's mouth opened to show its cruel fangs. She knew that it was hoping for some excuse to attack. It loved to maim and kill, and with the slightest excuse, it would rip into them all. "We'd better do as it says," she told Joshua. "No," he yelled. "I won't. You said that you were waiting for the best time to break free. Well, this is it. There are only 3 guards left, and it looks like Ross has his own troubles." "Joshua!" she yelled, but it was too late. He ripped the collecting bag from his shoulders and threw it in slow motion to the seabed. "I'm not going back to work," he yelled at the guard. "What are you going to do about that?" Horrified, Lucy saw exactly what the guard intended to do. It swam away slightly and then whipped around, teeth bared. It was going to kill Joshua. Without hesitation, she snatched up Joshua's discarded bag. As the guard shot past her, she threw the strap from the bag about its neck and then hung on grimly. The strap tightened about the guard's throat, cutting deeply into its windpipe. Unlike the merfolk, the guards still needed to breathe air from time to time. Even though the guard could go for half an hour between breaths, its instincts told it that it was being strangled, and it panicked. The raking teeth missed Joshua entirely as the guard twisted, trying to get Lucy off its back. She held tight to the straps, twisting them in her hands to get more leverage. She'd almost forgotten that the change had increased her strength until she heard the snap of the guard's neck and felt its death throes. In shock, Lucy let go of the straps. The broken body of the dead guard sank slowly to the seabed. She could do nothing but stare at it, hardly able to understand what she had done. "Lucy!" cried Joshua happily. "You did it! You killed the guard!" He whirled about to face the other children. They had stopped working to watch what they had felt certain would be Joshua getting killed. Instead, they had witnessed the unexpected. A miracle. "They're vulnerable!" Joshua yelled, pointing to the fallen guard. "And there are only 2 of them left." The children needed no further urging. As one, they went for the 2 remaining guards. The seals had been bred to be killers, but even they couldn't stand against this force. One of them fastened its teeth onto Patrick's arm and tore the limb apart in a spray of blood that clouded the water. Patrick screamed and went rigid in death. The guard didn't even have the time to spit out the arm before 6 of the children, wielding stones torn from the seabed, battered it into pulp. The final guard tried to flee, but the children were faster. 2 of them grabbed the guard's flukes, and the rest of them descended on it like locusts, hammering away at it, not letting up until it was a bloody smear in the dark sand. "We did it!" Joshua cried triumphantly. "We're free!" Sarah watched numbly as Ross loosened the straps on Kipling. The boy, thankfully, was still unconscious and thus unaware of what was in store for him. "Are you still so certain that I cannot change the future?" asked Breckinridge. "Yes," the doctor broke in. "I think you'd better take a look behind you." Breckinridge laughed. "Come, Doctor, how naive do you think I am?" The doctor shrugged. "What are my choices? But this is no bluff. Your undersea slaves are revolting, and they appear to be winning." With a cry, Breckinridge glanced over his shoulder. He saw in horror what Sarah saw in hope. The mer children had turned on the guards and were beating the living daylights out of them. Ross stared at the scene too, transfixed, supporting Kipling with his one good hand. The doctor moved slowly, uncurling several lengths of his scarf. Then, while even Brogan and Raintree were distracted by the battle beyond the glass, he whipped out a length of the scarf, looping it neatly about Raintree's gun hand, and jerked the thug off balance. "Now would be a good time to use that stick," he snapped at Colonel Ross. Ross smiled and whipped up his walking stick. Sarah recalled his use of the stick during the hunt, and that it was actually a single-shot air rifle. There was a loud hiss of the compressed gas going off. Ross had aimed at Breckinridge, but the industrialist, either through luck or some preternatural instinct, had moved slightly. The bullet missed him and slammed into the glass wall beyond. Instantly, the spider-webbed cracks started to form in the glass. "Dear God!" cried Dr. Ross. "The pressure outside!" It was obvious what he meant. They were way down below the water level here, and the crack in the glass gave it a terrible weak spot. In seconds, the wall could collapse. Sarah slipped the scalpel she had hidden into her hand and stabbed at Ross with it, striking his good hand. Ross screamed as blood bubbled up and let Kipling fall. Sarah grabbed for the boy, managing to hold on to him. As she tried to straighten up, the room degenerated into mad confusion. Raintree had staggered aside as the doctor jerked him off balance. Panicking, he fired. The bullet slammed into the glass wall, creating another series of growing cracks before the doctor could wrest the gun from his hand. Brogan whirled around and brought his gun up, centering on the back of the doctor's skull. Sarah cried out, but there was nothing she could do. The revolver that had somehow appeared in Doyle's hand spat fire. Brogan was thrown backwards, his chest a mass of blood. He was either dead or dying. Colonel Ross spun about and reversed his grip on his walking stick. He whirled it in a lethal arc that finished in Raintree's skull, splattering blood and bone about. "You've got to stop this habit of killing," the doctor snapped. "We've got to get out of here," Ross countered. "That glass won't hold for much longer. Abercrombie," he yelled, "the boy." Sarah was still trying to get Kipling up when Abercrombie gently but firmly pushed her aside and scooped the boy up. He flung Kipling over one shoulder, giving her a quick grin. "Time for the better part of valour," he grunted, scuttling off under his burden. Sarah didn't need any further encouragement. Over the groans and yells she could hear the sound of cracking, and that meant that the water was about to break through. As she sprinted out of the room, she saw she was behind Abercrombie and Doyle, who were both herring down the dank corridor ahead of her. Despite his load, Abercrombie was managing a respectable speed. Sarah glanced back and saw that Ross and the doctor were hard on her heels. How far did they have to get to be safe? She had no idea. And how long did they have before the glass wall gave way and the sea rushed in? It couldn't be more than minutes, and possibly not even that long. Once the water came through, it would flood the corridors in next to no time. She tried to remember her hydrodynamics, but science had never been her strong point. Didn't water speed up when faced with a constriction? If so, then as soon as the ocean broke into the corridor, it would send a killer wave after them all. Talk about encouragement for speed. Sarah's ribs ached and her lungs felt as if they were on fire as she ran for her life. Breckinridge glared about the viewing room, fury eclipsing every other emotion, even his drive for self-preservation. His prisoners had escaped, at least for the moment, and his world was crumbling. Raintree lay dead on the floor, his blood and brains leaking from his shattered skull. Ross had vanished with the others. His slaves outside in the ocean had finished killing the guards and had vanished into the darkness beyond. Cold rage building inside him, he started for the door. As he passed Brogan, the injured man reached out a trembling hand. "Help me," he gasped. Blood was frothing up in his chest wound, and he was desperate. "Go to hell," Breckinridge growled, kicking away the groping hand. Ignoring the weakening pleas of the dying thug, he left the viewing room and ran up the corridor to where the final guards were kept. He unlocked the door and threw it open. Snarling, the 4 enhanced dogs strained at their chains. They were monsters of their kind, taken from attack dogs bred in Europe and given extra cunning and a drive to kill by Ross's salve and human fluid implants. All 4 were ready to do his bidding, desiring nothing more than to kill. Breckinridge crossed to the main link of the chain and unlocked it. As the heavy chains fell away, he gestured at the door. "After them!" he screamed. "Instruments of my vengeance! Kill!" 3 of the beasts leaped to obey him instantly, dashing through the door. The 4th whipped around and bared its teeth. Breckinridge barely had the time to realize that Ross had made these dogs too well. Their only drive was to kill, and they didn't care who their victims were. He backed away as the hound jumped. Teeth raked through his upraised arm, shredding flesh and bone alike. He had time for one last scream before the dog's teeth fastened onto his throat. Dr. Ross, whimpering and racked with pain from his injured hands, staggered into his laboratory. Everything had gone wrong. Breckinridge had ruined it all, insisting on boasting and playing games with his captives. The man's ego had brought everything crashing down about them, and in seconds that could become more than just a metaphor. Ross saw that his plans were finished, and everything had crumbled. Once again his accursed brother had beaten him. He whimpered from the agony in his hands caused by Sarah. One hand was broken, the other ripped apart from the scalpel she had wielded. He couldn't bear the pain any more, and he staggered across to plunge his hands into the healing salve. In seconds, most of the pain was gone, and he felt the gel soaking into his body. And then the world exploded. He heard the shattering of the glass in the viewing room even from this distance. Blindly, he looked around, wondering where he could run or hide. But there was nowhere left. A roaring sound filled the corridors as the waters crashed in, flooding through in a wave of tidal fury. It slammed into the laboratory like a hammer, shattering equipment, splintering the tables and then soaking him, throwing him back against the wall. It felt as if his spine had been crushed, and pain and fire filled his ravaged body. The gel was still working, however. Even as he fought against the rising water, struggling for breath, he felt the burning within his limbs as the salve took control of his body. Would he drown, or would the cream cause some mutation that might enable him to somehow survive? There was no way to tell, and no time left. As he lost consciousness, his body burned about him. Sarah ran as fast as she could, trusting that Doyle and Abercrombie knew the route back. She had not seen it, of course, as she had been insensate when she was brought here. Dimly, in the distance behind her, down the twists and turns of the passageway, she could hear something. Even over the pounding of blood in her ears, there was no mistaking the howl of a dog. Several dogs. The Guardians are out, she realised desperately. There was no doubt that they'd be coming down the passageway after them, to get away from the water if nothing else, and they had been bred to kill. She simply couldn't move any faster. As it was, she didn't know how much longer she could keep up her current pace. She ached terribly, her lungs felt like they were burning inside her, and her legs were almost ready to seize up. "We're here!" Doyle gasped back to her as they came to the bottom of a flight of steps that appeared suddenly from the gloom. He was still holding his revolver, and he stopped, waving her on with it. "I've got a couple of bullets left," he panted. "Go on, I'll cover us." Sarah didn't waste time or breath arguing. Instead, she started up the stairs, every step jarring and painful. After what felt like minutes, she saw Abercrombie shoot out of sight at the top, and then Sarah plunged onto the factory floor right behind him. "Out the door!" he gasped, leading the way. She saw that he was almost on the verge of collapse, so she went to offer him help with Kipling. "Move it!" he sighed. Together they half-carried, half-dragged the boy to the doorway. Behind them they heard rapid footsteps, and then the doctor, Ross and Doyle were with them. The doctor wasted no time or words, but simply kicked open the factory door. And then the dogs bounded out of the gap in the floor. There were 3 of them, and in the dim light all Sarah could make out was powerful bodies and rows of sharp, drooling fangs. Suddenly there were hands helping her through the doorway. Through the red haze that had settled over her eyes, she could make out several people. "Get them out of the way!" Sir Edward Fulbright snapped. He had a rifle at his shoulder and was poised to fire. Sarah accepted the help without question, and she was dragged aside by 2 people. She fell against one and realised that it was Alice. "Thank God we got here in time!" exclaimed the girl. "Indubitably," agreed Sarah, as she sucked in the fresh night air. Then there was a barrage of firing as Fulbright and his men let the 3 attacking dogs have the full force of their guns. The animals howled in pain, but went down. The doctor dropped to the ground beside Sarah. For once, he looked as if he had been through the wars too. There was a gash down one cheek, and his deerstalker was missing. His scarf fluttered in the breeze, and there was a happy gleam in his eyes. 3 cheers for the 7th Cavalry, he joked. "Is it over?" Sarah asked. There was a ringing in her ears as Fulbright and his men fired a second time. All sounds and movements from the dogs ceased. "No," the doctor informed her. "It's far from over. But the war is done. Now we have the peace to negotiate. I have to stop Ross from doing anything foolish, which isn't likely to be very easy."